Hello, this is Sean Sperry, and in this presentation we're going to do the updates for Spectrum Protect for virtual environments and Spectrum Protect Snapshot for the second quarter of 2017. So this is version 8.1.2, and as I'm recording this, it's August of 2017. Now, as you probably know if you've listened to any of these videos, my colleague Trisha Zhang provides the updates for the server, client, HSM, and Unix. And in this presentation, what I'm going to be covering is VE, both VMware and HyperV, and also Spectrum Protect Snapshot for Windows. Now, just to get starting, a little background side. As you probably know, VMware introduced VVols at version 6.x, and those VVols are supported through a VASA2 provider, which is provided by the storage vendor to interface with the storage subsystem hardware. Now, Spectrum Accelerate and Spectrum Virtualize both support these VVols in a VMware environment, and the name of the software that provides the VASA2 interface for Spectrum Accelerate and Spectrum Virtualize is Spectrum Control. Now, for Spectrum Protect, which is intended to do backups, what we do is we interface with VMware's APIs to support those snapshots, and which in turn coordinates and communicates with the underlying hardware. The reason I'm discussing this background is in version 8.1.2 we have introduced some new features for data protection for VE in support of VVols. Now, we have supported VVols on VMware since version 7.1.4, and we allowed the backup of VMs hosted on these VVol data stores, but we did not support any of the features that were associated with hardware snapshots and VVols. And in 8.1.2, we've introduced features in data protection for VMware which allow the creation of persistent snapshots on VVols, which you can use to restore individual virtual machines or files within those virtual machines. The persistent snapshots are created on the back-end hardware using this VASA provider, and you can also, just as you've always done, copy those snapshots to the Spectrum Protect server if you choose to, for multiple layers of protection should you be concerned that you're going to potentially lose your hardware. So this really provides some of the same functionality that used to be provided by Spectrum Protect Snapshot, but is now included in Spectrum Protect for virtual environments. The management of this function is going to be done through the vSphere client. So you have a GUI that allows you to do the management of it, which you can see over here, the standard vSphere client or vSphere web client. And you can also do it through a command line if you choose to, but the web GUI tends to be much easier. So this slide presents some of the features of this persistent snapshot functionality on VMware when used with data protection for VMware. There are basically two ways to do this. One is this so-called Backup Now capability, which allows the admin via the web GUI to create a persistent snapshot during the backup of a VM hosted on a VVol, and optionally send it to the Spectrum Protect server. You can also schedule this functionality using the scheduling feature of Spectrum Protect for virtual environments data protection for VMware. And what most people will want to do and may choose to do is to schedule multiple persistent backup snapshots during the day, and then as an option maybe only send one of those snapshots to the Spectrum Protect server. So maybe you create 3 or 4 or 5 snapshots during the day, and then at night send one to the Spectrum Protect server for longer term storage. Now, obviously from a restore perspective, the restore of these snapshots is likely to be considerably faster than pulling them back from the Spectrum Protect server, because those snapshots are stored directly on the VVol with the virtual machine. We have a special name for this function. It's called a fast revert. So if you do a restore of a virtual machine using data protection for VMware, you will now see this option called fast revert, which allows you to pull the virtual machine from a snapshot on a VVol if one exists. Of course, you also have the same options you always used to have from the Spectrum Protect server of doing a restore, an instant restore, or an instant access. Now, just a note here, because these snapshots are logical, we only allow revert to the original name, so you cannot do a revert to a different name of the virtual machine. Now, from a file level restore perspective, we of course have the self-service file restore graphical user interface for data protection for VMware, which allows end users to restore files inside of their virtual machine. And we wanted to keep that as simple as we possibly could and very simple to use. So really there has been no changes to this self-service interface for data protection for VMware. The users will just see what they always see, and basically they also only see restore points. So they do not see whether the file is located on the Spectrum Protect server or in a VVol based snapshot. And what happens behind the scenes is, if the user picks a file that is indeed in a snapshot, then that will be used to restore the file. But if, on the other hand, they pick a file that is stored on the Spectrum Protect server, then the graphical user interface and the software will go out there to the Spectrum Protect server, look inside the VM backup to get the file. Application protection support for VVols. As you probably know if you've been working with Spectrum Protect for a little while, that we do support consistent backups of both Exchange and SQL Server when they are stored on virtual machines in a VMware environment. And that is using this include.vm tsm vss statement or tag, depending on how you do it and whether you're doing it through the GUI or an options file. Now, when we first introduced VVols, we did not support this function for virtual machines that were stored on VVols, but in version 8.1.2 we have gone ahead and added that functionality to the application protection support. Now, there are a few limitations for this still, and again, this is something we're working on in our agile development, and those limitations are best described by taking a look at this table. So I'm not going to read it to you completely, but just tell you about the features. Basically, we've added support for application protection in VM-based backups where the backup is stored on the Spectrum Protect server. If, however, the backup is stored in a persistent snapshot on a VVol, we will be doing individual database restore and individual mail restore in a future version coming up. Okay. Moving on to some additional features of Spectrum Protect version 8.1.2. And again, this is a slide that should be very familiar if you've been following our releases in Spectrum Protect data protection for VMware. We have been, through the last several agile releases, enhancing the performance and the parallelism of data protection for VMware. So we always did do parallel backup support for multiple VMs in parallel. In version 8.1, we added backup support for a single VM with multiple VMDKs in parallel. And we also add multiple thread support for a single VM with a single large VMDK in parallel. Now, as far as restore goes, that's something that we've been adding as we go along. So in version 8.1, we added restore for a parallel-based restore for a single VM with a single large VMDK in parallel. And the new addition in version 8.1.2 is a single virtual machine with multiple VMDKs on it. So if you have this large virtual machine, say 4 terabytes, 1 terabyte, 2 terabyte, and it has multiple VMDKs, when you go to do a restore now, you will have the ability to restore multiple of those VMDKs in parallel. Still working, and in the future, coming in a future Agile release, will be the restoring multiple VMs in parallel from a single data mover. Now, these are the performance options that you can control to define the amount of parallelism you get. VM max parallel, VM limit per host, VM max backup sessions, and VM max restore sessions. These have not changed from version 8.1, but you just get the added functionality of 8.1.2 when you use them today. Okay, so continuing with the version 8.1.2 features, as most of you probably know, we continue to, in almost every quarterly release of data protection for VE, add additional feature functionality to the vSphere web client. And version 8.1.2 is no exception. So in this release, we have added certification for the vSphere 6.5 web client in HTML5 mode. We've enhanced the getting started experience through the vSphere client, so it helps guide new users through how to set things up and how to use the vSphere client to support Spectrum Protect. We've added some enhanced schedule history and monitoring panels, which we'll see in a screenshot coming up. We've given more information about load balance use that will help you determine if rebalancing your VMs among node data movers is required. We've moved the mount cleanup for manual unmount situations from the old web-based client to the vSphere client, again, to help you keep users in one single user interface. And we've enhanced both the backup wizard and the restore wizard in the vSphere client to give you additional options, so you can change the properties of a virtual machine when you back it up. And from a restore, we have some additional options that allow you to set a minimum VM configuration and change the provisioning type. I have a few screenshots here that I just like to show you on some of these new features. Here you see the IBM Spectrum Protect Getting Started interface, and again, this is just some getting started information that helps VMware administrators who are new to the product kind of get started protecting databases and configuring the system, and then viewing the schedules and viewing information about what's been backed up and maybe doing ad hoc actions. This is a screenshot of the new monitor panel for Spectrum Protect. So in addition to looking at the status of backed up machines as a whole, we're also allow you to pick a particular schedule. So here you see a schedule that is highlighted is this KHA DC hourly, and you can get further information about the status of the backup in that schedule, the number of VMs succeeded, and the number of VMs failed. So this is overview information on a per schedule basis. So you see here we've selected the schedule, we clicked on it, and you can see the status of the virtual machines in that schedule. You can either sort on status, sort on data mover, or sort on error code, and get information about the various data movers. Now, one of the things that I want to point out here when you look at this schedule is this status screen indicates the overall status of the infrastructure. So that will give you an indication of whether your infrastructure is working. And then you can look at this VM succeeded and VMs failed here. This is not a great example because here you can see we have some failing infrastructure, but here you can see that one VM succeeded and one VM failed in this particular screenshot. So that gives you some further information on a schedule by schedule basis. When you go in and edit a schedule to change the data movers that are associated with it, you will get some additional information about past backups using that data mover. So here you see we've clicked a particular schedule and we've done an edit, and you can see the number of VMs associated with that particular schedule on a particular data mover, the byte data transmitted, and the duration trend. So whether it's going up or down when compared to other data movers. So again, that gives you some further information about how your load is balanced across data movers. And then finally, here we see the ad hoc backup of virtual machine and ad hoc restore of virtual machine dialogues. And as you can see here, we have the ability to override the pre-configured settings for a virtual machine when you do a backup. So for instance, you can change the backup destination. This one's doing snapshots and server. You can change whether application protection is enabled, or change the backup type on the fly. From a restore perspective, we've added a couple different options to this dialog box. One of these is you can do a minimum restore, which does not restore the configuration but only restores the data, which may be useful in some specific circumstances. Okay, so that's data protection for VMware. Moving on to data protection for HyperV. We've done a lot of work in data protection for HyperV in this release. And as you probably know, if you're using HyperV, Windows 2016 introduced new RCT, or Resilient Change Tracking, for HyperV virtual machines. This was really done by Microsoft as an improved way to track the changes in Hyper-V VMs, and it really removes the need for Spectrum Protect and other backup products to implement its own mechanism for incremental backups. Really the equivalent to change-based tracking, change block tracking for VMware in Hyper-V. Now, when you're using RCT in Windows 2016, in prior versions you needed this AVHDX file, which was persistent and recorded the changes in order to do incremental backups. When you're using RCT with data protection for Hyper-V version 8.1.2, you no longer need that AVHDX file. So it's really an improvement and much more scalable than previous versions. Now, there are some caveats to the support for RCT and Hyper-V. All VMs must be at the functional level 6.2 or greater, so when you're upgrading to Windows 2016, you may have to consider upgrading the functional level of the virtual machines. The install of this is very easy. It doesn't have a data mover architecture. You just install the product on your Windows 2016 hypervisor. Now, we do support standard and data center hosts and both the desktop experience and server core modes. Currently, we do not support Windows 2016 Nano as a host, but we do support it as a guest in Microsoft Hyper-V. Now, in addition to supporting RCT, we've also added some additional features to the product and to Windows 2016 support when you're using RCT. We have added this include VM snapshots parameter, which will attempt to do consistent data protection of the VMs before switching to a crash consistent snapshot. So basically, when you set this, you set up X consistent snapshots and then, X consistent snapshots, and then it will try Y crash consistent snapshots before doing a backup. Now, in order to use this feature, you do require integration services be installed in the guest VM and also on the host hypervisor. We have added a feature to include and exclude specific Hyper-V virtual disks for Windows 2016. We have included support for physical disks, which is the equivalent of RDMs in VMware, with this VM process VM with phys disks parameter and this VM skip phys disk parameter when doing a restore. And then finally, as in the previous version, we do expect that most people will implement Hyper-V in a cluster. So you can back up the virtual machines in Hyper-V cluster from any node in the cluster and restore them to any node. And with RCT, the VM migration will not impact the incremental backup chain. There is one restriction in the current version, version 8.1.2, which is that VHD set disks, which are used with guest clusters, are not supported. So clusters are not, those VHD set disks are not supported for guests, but clusters certainly are supported for your Hyper-V infrastructure. Now, in addition to the new support for Windows 2016 RCT, we've also improved the reliability and performance of Spectrum Protect on Windows 2012. We have supported backing up Hyper-V on Spectrum Protect with Spectrum Protect data protection for VMware in Windows 2012 for quite a while. But what we've done in this version is made it faster and more reliable than it was in previous versions by working in the product to reduce snapshot contention from within the threads of the product and also reducing cross-process snapshot contention for cluster nodes managed through a new retry mechanism. So when you're using data protection for Hyper-V on a Windows 2012 system with 8.1.2, there should be no need for staggered schedules across cluster nodes, and you should see improved performance automatically with the default settings of the new release. Now, we have added some new parameters in 8.1.2, including this VM max per snapshot number or parameter that specifies the number of VMs to include in a snapshot, and this VM max snapshot retry, which specifies the number of snapshot retry attempts should there be contention. The default for both of those is 20, and you can increase them depending on the performance of your system. But in trying these in our labs, we found that 20 was a good default for those. So just installing 8.1.2 should see increased performance and reliability on Windows 2012. Now finally moving on to data protection for Windows and snapshot for Windows. There's a couple of enhancements that I'd like to point out in 8.1.2. And remember, data protection for SQL Server, data protection for Exchange, and snapshot for those products are basically the same product, same code. It just depends on where you're storing the backups. So these changes are going to apply to all of those products. Beginning in version 8.1.2, we now support change data capture tables in SQL Server. And you can get the CDC capture tables back by using this either on the command line using this -keep CDC parameter, or in the MMC by changing this keep CDC parameter to yes. Note that this is supported for legacy backups and restored only. It's ignored for VSS restore since you're doing a snapshot restore. And in order for this to be effective and actually to succeed, you have to run the recovery from the data protection for SQL Server interface. We've also included in 8.1.2 a new scheduling wizard, which now allows configuration of the Spectrum Protect scheduler for backup jobs. We used to run using the Microsoft Windows scheduler, which wasn't very robust, so we've added that feature now. It creates and optionally executes a macro on the Protect server when you run this up to set up the schedules. Note that you must have the client acceptor daemon configured and used for scheduling in order for this to work. And then finally, a small enhancement for PowerShell. In virtually all of the previous versions of this product, everything about the product and the backups could be controlled with PowerShell. And beginning in version 8.1.2, the commandlets in the PS module path environment will be automatically discovered and loaded upon use. You used to have to go out there and use a PowerShell command to load these modules up. Now it's done automatically for you, so it's an ease of use enhancement. So that concludes the 8.1.2 enhancements for VE. I hope you found this information useful. I do put out a lot of videos on Spectrum Protect, so if you find this kind of technical information useful, please subscribe to my channel so you can be notified when I put out a new video. Thanks for your attention.